choosing which horse you're going to take is terrible. It's always been our policy, and I stand very, very firm on this policy, that we only rescue our horses from slaughter by outbidding a kill buyer in the auction ring. There are some organizations that like to wait until the kill buyer's bought all of his horses. Then they go look at the ones that they've bought, and then they offer them a profit on those horses. I don't believe in doing that. And the reason I don't is because I don't believe that our donors gave us money to say, go put this money in a meat buyer's pocket. Go make him richer. Because all I see that doing when people do that is they're just giving this man profit. And that profit might be enough that maybe one horse is off the truck and now he can afford two more. So what have you saved? Sure, you saved the one that you saw, and the horse you saw certainly might be worthy, but the two you didn't see are just as worthy as that one. And I don't see any reason to be paying these kill buyers profits. So we will outbid them in the ring, and only in the ring. The kill buyers are going to buy many more than we could ever take. They have more money than we do. They're moving horses faster than we do. For every sale we go to, I typically have permission to come home with anywhere from like 2 to 6 horses, depending on how much room we have at the rescue. And I know that that day, that kill buyer, is probably loading each truck they have there with 35. So they might be filling 2 or 3 trucks, and I don't really know. The other thing we have to watch out for is we never want to outbid a private home. There's always a chance that somebody else saw that horse and just happened to like it, just the way that I liked our Elijah, who was, our first save. So if I start bidding on a horse and I've outbid the kill buyer, and now the number's creeping up, but we're getting into a price that isn't something a kill buyer would pay, then at that point I drop out, because I don't want to outbid a private home that's trying to bring a horse home. I want to keep it possible for them to bring a horse home. Most of the kill buyers know who we are, and they know that we're going to be there to get draft horses. Most of them are indifferent. I mean, as long as I'm not bothering them, they don't bother me. We are not rude to them, but not pleasant either. I understand that, they are doing a job that's a completely legal job. I might not like it. I might disagree with it. I might think it's disgusting, but that doesn't give me a license to be ignorant to them. And it also would benefit no one to act that way. We came really close this year to having slaughterhouses come back. There were a couple that actually were days away from being able to legally open the doors. And I know that some of the larger organizations that have the ability to lobby and to, intercede on the federal level were fighting very, very hard. Some of them even fighting with delay tactics to just buy time. We really lucked out that when this year's agricultural spending bill was passed, and that includes the spending for the USDA, that the wording was put back in that said that tax dollars were not going to be used to fund the inspection of horse carcasses for export. So that saved us for a year. Unfortunately, the spending bill will be reevaluated next year. So we do know that we have 1 year clear and free right now, but that's not to say that next year this wouldn't happen. Now, I would imagine if next year that wording is removed and people move to open slaughterhouses, they're going to be met with the same resistance as they were this past 2 years. And it will probably be battled and battled. I mean, our only hope is that we can get the SAFE Act passed. I'm just not sure that that's going to happen. Similar legislations existed in the past, and it's never made it out of committee. And unfortunately, in DC, money often speaks louder than common sense or even the will of the people. And despite 80% of the United States population agreeing that they don't believe horses should be slaughtered for human consumption, unfortunately, it's big money agriculture that has pushed for this industry, and they want it here. So they've done a pretty effective job of keeping this bill from ever going forward. So I think that just like the bill before it, which was the Horse Slaughter Prevention Act of 2011, I think it'll sit in committee, never be acted upon, and die. We try to get petitions and try to encourage people to write to their congressmen and their senators and tell them how strongly they feel about this, and that Them signing on to this bill is kind of contingent on them reelecting them, but we've submitted over 400,000 signatures on petitions already and haven't seen any movement yet. So we'll just keep trying. Here's a very sick thing that a lot of people don't even realize happens, and it is horse slaughter, but it's slightly different than the main issue of horse slaughter. There's horse slaughter for human consumption, which is what is not legal in the United States right. Well, I shouldn't say it is legal. It is not happening in the United States right now because there is no USDA funding for the inspection of carcasses. So that is what's happening in Canada and Mexico. But there's also horse slaughter that's not for human consumption. And that's primarily actually going to our zoos to feed the lions and the tigers and the bears. Now, with those horses, those packing plants actually are looking for thin horses, because what a tiger in the middle of the Sahara Desert would, or a lion would eat would probably be a very, very lean, ribby antelope. So they are looking to purchase horses who are in poor condition and lean and thin. And I've heard reports that one of the major packing plants for zoo horse meat is Bravo Packing out in New Jersey. And I've heard reports that they do keep lots of horses there that they purposely starve down because they want them very, very thin, because the zoos are looking for a leaner meat. And I think the reason that that hasn't received the same public outcry as slaughter for human consumption is because it happens on such an incredibly minor scale. When we're talking about horses for human consumption, we're talking about just under 200,000 horses a year. When we're talking about horses that are being slaughtered for consumption at zoos, we're probably talking a drop in the bucket compared to that. So I think as far as outrage, there just hasn't been as much interest in it. Number one, because people just don't know. And number two, because right now the biggest grievance that we have to solve is trying to keep our U.S. horses from being exported for slaughter. The methods that are currently used to slaughter horses in Canada are the same as were used here in the United States. Mexico's just horrific. What they do is just inexcusable, and I don't even understand how anyone can live with themselves. So that's a different story entirely. But methods that are used in Canada and that were used in the United States are typically methods that are used and were designed as being humane for cattle. And with this method, the horse enters a kill box and its head sticks out. And ideally, they would take typically a captive bolt, which is like a 4-inch long bolt that's very wide. And the person has to kind of line it up on the horse's head. With a cow, this works relatively well. They have very, very short necks, and they don't have as strong as a flight instinct, so they don't really whip their heads around very much. The captive bolt doesn't kill the animal, but it does render it unconscious. Now with horses, they have necks that can be several feet long. They are prey animals. They do fling their head around. They'll do anything to avoid that. So oftentimes they're either not being struck appropriately, they're not being knocked unconscious, or they're being hit multiple times. The other method that's used is gunshot, but again, you have the same exact issue. Difficult to get the proper, strike on the first try. And because of the nature of working in a slaughterhouse, oftentimes slaughterhouses pay very, very little. It's incredibly dangerous work. It's a menial job, and it's very unsavory, even for anyone who does it. So typically you have kind of bottom of the barrel employees who are working for very, very low wages. They're not necessarily going to be the best trained. And that's where the biggest errors come into play. And oftentimes when undercover investigations happen, they find that, every slaughterhouse aims for less than a 5% fail rate, a fail rate being a missed hit on an animal. And oftentimes it's much, much higher. It's as high as 20 or 30%, because we don't have, they don't have trained personnel who are able to do a competent job. In Mexico, they use a box and they use a puntilla knife, which is a sharp little knife where actually they stab the horse in the spine repeatedly until it's paralyzed. Now, those horses are completely and totally awake. They feel everything that's going on. They know everything that's going on. They're just not able to stand anymore to fight it. Our issue with horse slaughter is that it's not a humane death for a horse, and that we don't see a horse as livestock. We see them as a companion animal because of the relationship that they've developed with humans. We don't have that same relationship with cattle and pigs and chickens. They are not our companion animals or our partners in sport and competition. So we feel it's immoral, it's unethical for us to slaughter horses. People who look at horses as livestock still can oppose slaughter, mainly by saying that there's a secondary issue here. Because these horses are not being raised for food, their whole entire lives, they're being given drugs that are not labeled for use in food animals. In fact, many of them are specifically labeled that they're prohibited for use in food animals. Most common drug is phenylbutazone. It's basically the equivalent of a common non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. It's horse Tylenol. So if you have a horse that gets a fever, you give it Bute. If you have a horse that has a sore leg, you give it Bute. I don't know a horse that's never had Bute unless it's a wild Mustang running out on the plains. Everybody keeps Bute in their barn, and it's given out pretty freely. But Bute is a carcinogen in people. We're not, the USDA says that we cannot eat an animal that's been given this drug. And on top of that drug, there's all the wormers that we give them for intestinal parasites. There's vaccines that we give them that aren't labeled for food animal use, not to mention topical medications like Furazone ointment that goes on cuts. All of these are proven to cause cancer in humans. So people should not be eating this meat. Even if you have no ethical opposition to the way horse slaughter is done, the meat that people in Europe are eating that's coming from our country is not safe. The horses that we rescue don't know each other prior to the auction most of the time. They always do form very tight bonds when they all come in together. They form a little family unit that normally gets along very, very well. So that helps during quarantine. Our first step when we first get them is make friends. And we make friends, of course, with delicious food. And for the horses we've gotten in that have been truly, truly terrified of people, it might literally be putting them in a relatively small paddock so they don't have the option of going out and grazing. We don't want them to be able to go out and fill their bellies on grass. But going out, and we might put a pile of hay out, and maybe on the first day we'll have a volunteer sit there with a book and read, or they can play on their computer. And the first day we might ask the horse to just accept us being 50 feet away. That's it. Just allow us to be in here and be 50 feet away. And then maybe the next day we ask them, could you tolerate eating 30 feet away from us? You know, and then the next day it might be 25. And we'll get there in little tiny baby steps until eventually they're eating out of your hand. When we have new horses come in, we go through an evaluation process that normally starts on the ground. What we're evaluating is how easily do the horses give to pressure? Do they understand what rein pressure is? Do they move off of our pressure and our energy, asking them to move around us? And that gives us a pretty decent understanding of how much training they have. We'll figure out very quickly if they're trained at all. Maybe we'll figure out that they might only be trained to drive, and then others we discover have a little bit of riding training, or even sometimes a lot of riding training there. So it's a pretty thorough process. We get a lot of information relatively quickly. Most of it is learned just, I guess, from doing it so long and figuring different horses out, that we've kind of developed this plan as a way to figure out what sort of training each horse has. The 3 horses that we worked with yesterday, we know for certain the one was broke to drive because he was a New York City horse. I was very pleasantly surprised that despite him being a very reactive horse, he actually is also a very sensible horse, and he took a rider rather quickly, even though that was probably the first time he had ever been ridden before. The other 2 horses are most likely Amish. They had a little bit more rudimentary experience and training, and maybe were a little bit more rough in their responses because they're used to working in straight lines and in groups, but they did very, very well. And I was very pleased with Karma, who came along pretty quickly. He'll end up being a very nice horse.